All right, everybody. Welcome to Quarantine Cooking with Crash and Wright. Today we're going to talk about making your own bread using commercial yeast. Commercial yeast is super easy to use. It comes from the grocery store, as opposed to sourdough yeast, which I have some of. It's wild yeast you grow yourself. You get it from a friend as a starter, and you feed it every couple of weeks. It's kind of hard to work with, whereas commercial yeast is super easy. So for now, we're going to put the sourdough yeast aside, and we'll come back to that in another broadcast and focus today on commercial yeast. You have to activate it to use it, and to activate it, you need to dissolve it in warm water. So we're going to put 2 1/4 cups of warm water in a big bowl. 1, 2. Sometimes you can use 2 1/2, depending on atmospheric conditions. Humidity really matters. It's kind of dry tonight, so I'm just going to use 2 1/4. And we're going to dissolve 4 teaspoons of the commercial yeast in your warm water. You want it evenly distributed around the surface of the water so it fully dissolves. 2, 3, 4. And once that's in, you don't want to move the bowl much because the yeast will go up the side, stick, and then not dissolve. So you're going to cover that, keep it warm. Warmth really matters to yeast. The warmer it is, the better. Up to a point. You don't want to use too hot of water because it'll kill the yeast, but you're going to leave that alone for like 10 minutes. All right, it's been 10 minutes. I switched towels because I thought this one was more photogenic. You could see most of our yeast is dissolved, almost all of it, and now we're going to add the rest of our ingredients. When you're working with commercial yeast, it's pretty forgiving, so I'm just going to add 4 cups of bread flour. Bread flour has more gluten than all-purpose flour. You can use all-purpose flour. I used it for years before I got a good supply of bread flour, but this stuff's better. And then 2 cups of wheat flour. Bread flour has more gluten, and gluten is what allows bread to rise. It makes little pockets for the gas that yeast produce, and that's what gives your bread loft. So 4 cups of bread flour, 2 cups of wheat flour, and to that we're going to add 2 tablespoons of kosher salt. I like kosher salt. You can use iodized or sea salt. This is a very forgiving recipe. So 2 tablespoons of whatever salt, except don't use the big chunky stuff because it doesn't fully dissolve when you cook it. You get these weird chunks of salt in your bread. It sucks. We're going to use just under 1/3 cup of aquafaba. Aquafaba is the starchy water in cans of chickpeas. It's a substitute for eggs. So it acts as a binder. I've had really good results using aquafaba. You know, a lot of times vegan recipe substitutions kind of suck. Aquafaba is actually really good. Now remember, 1 egg equals 3 tablespoons of aquafaba. Normally I would use 2 eggs in this recipe, so we're using 6 tablespoons, which is just under 1/3 cup. We're going to add 1/3 cup of oil and 1/4 cup of honey. You can use honey or sugar or maple syrup or molasses. It doesn't really matter. I've used molasses in this recipe, and it gave the bread a really nice caramely taste. I would do it again. I like molasses more than most people, I think, so don't hesitate to try that. But in the meantime, you know, whatever's in your pantry, and today we had lots of honey, so we did 1/4 cup of honey. Now you're going to stir all your ingredients together, trying to evenly distribute them as much as you can. Scrape the sides and bottom of the bowl so your dry ingredients don't isolate themselves from the water. And just get it as mixed as you can. You know, because we're not using like a cooking scale, there's a little bit of give and take with the amount of each ingredient, and there's a lot of flour in here as opposed to water. It seems a tiny bit dry. I'm not getting it's not sticky at all, which is not a big deal, but I'm going to add a little bit more aquafaba. It's a little bit of a dry night. Atmospheric conditions really do contribute to like the amount of humidity in your ingredients, so that should get it to emulsify a little more. Once those are good and blended, go ahead and get your hands in there. Make sure you washed them a bunch. I have in this case. I think we've all been washing our hands a lot this week. Use that to kind of mash all your ingredients together. You're going to sort of start the kneading process in the bowl, and this will allow you to sort of blend your ingredients as effectively as possible. You want everything really good and blended so you don't get pockets of anything weird in the bread. You don't want a pocket of salt when you're having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something. That's just nasty. So once things are starting to kind of turn into a shaggy dough ball, you're going to move it out onto the counter. The first thing you'll do is dust your counter with a light dusting of flour so that the dough ball doesn't stick to the counter. The flour will dry out the dough a little bit and keep it from sticking. Wet dough, sticky dough. So get your ingredients that are stuck to the sides of the bowl out and go ahead and integrate them into your dough ball. Set that aside. You're going to rinse that and reuse it. This loaf is still a little dry. I don't mind that so much. It's keeping it from sticking to my hands and sticking to the counter. If you're at this stage and everything's super sticky, just add a little bit of flour. I like to keep adding bread flour. Some folks go cheap and just add all-purpose at that point. But, I feel like that's probably going to change it a little bit to add more flour, and so I want to just keep it consistent. You're going to do this for about 10 minutes and get your ingredients really well distributed through the dough ball. And as you work it, you'll see the gluten fiber is going to make it more cohesive. So now you got a nice dough ball. You're going to get your now clean bowl, and you're going to add 1 tablespoon of liquid oil. Either, in this case, I'm using sunflower oil. You can use emulsified coconut oil. You can use melted butter. You can use olive oil. But what you're doing is you're going to coat the bottom and a little bit of the side of the bowl, and we're going to make it so that our dough ball, when it rises, doesn't stick to the bowl that we rise it in. So drop your dough ball in, coat one side with oil, flip it over. Use your hands to evenly distribute oil around the surface of the dough ball. And once that's nice and oily, we're going to cover it again. Set it in a high place or wherever it's warmest, on top of a radiator or whatever, as long as it's not going to be so hot that it cooks it. And it's going to rise for 2 hours. All right, it's been 2 hours. Here are our bread pans. These bread pans are 5.5 by 9.5. It's a little bit bigger than a standard bread pan, but it's good for a loaf. It's bigger than like a banana bread loaf, about the right size for a sandwich loaf. I'm going to coat the inside of these with cooking spray. You could use coconut oil, butter, olive oil, whatever, just to keep the loaf from sticking when it cooks. Set those aside. Let's have a look at our dough ball. In 2 hours, this has roughly doubled in size. If it's on a radiator, it might double in size quicker, but double is good. Double is about what you want. You're going to punch down the trapped gas in the bread so that it can escape and we can knead it some more. Take your now kind of oily dough ball, put it on the counter, give it a light dusting of flour so it doesn't stick. As you work this dough ball, it's going to get a little sticky as the moisture works its way to the surface. I don't know what that is, but I don't want to eat it, so let's put that aside. What the heck was that? And we're going to knead this for about 10 minutes, at least 10 minutes, maybe a little more. I have a technique that I've kind of developed over the years where I work the dough into kind of an oblong shape and give it a fold, and then work it into an oblong shape and give it a fold. And what I'm doing here is lengthening the gluten fibers, because as you kind of work it into this long shape, your gluten fibers lengthen, they kind of link up and form a kind of chain. And the more gluten fibers you have linked in your bread, the more of a rise you're going to get out of it. We have another 30-minute rise coming up, and then there's a thing called oven spring. We'll talk about oven spring in a minute. But after about 10 minutes, you'll see that the surface of the bread is nice and smooth, right? It's looking more like, bread dough. And it's nice and plastic, as we used to say in the concrete business. And it's very pliant. So this is my grandma's bench knife. Isn't that cool? Carbon steel blade. Had that thing forever. Oops, kick the tripod. Sorry. So we're going to work the first one into a loaf shape. I'm going to use it to kind of, the fact that the inside is a little sticky is going to let me get some of the extra flour up off the bench and keep it from getting too sticky. And by loaf shape, I mean like a potato or a shoe. Like, just put that in a bread pan. We'll come back to that. This other one, I'm going to do something a little more traditional. I'm going to break it into 3 roughly equal size balls, and I'm going to lengthen those into long, thin ropes, and I'm going to braid them. This is how you make challah bread. This is how you make the sort of Russian Easter bread. When you've got good gluten fiber formation in a loaf, you get a thing called oven spring. And that is where when the bread heats, the steam is trying to escape, and your gluten fibers are strong enough that it's trapping some of it, and that causes the bread to kind of blow up a little bit. And so if you don't have a way for the bread's surface tension to expand without cracking, you'll get these weird cracks down the side of the loaf. And I mean, they don't look too bad, but then when you go to make a sandwich, like, pieces will flake off in a weird way. This is a lame, and a lame is a French tool that you can score the top of your bread with, and that allows some expansion upwards, and it splits at the lames, and then you don't have like cracking on the sides. But I really like the braided thing. I don't do a ton of scoring these days. Almost every loaf of bread I make is braided. So I work out these long, thin ropes of dough. As you can see, they're very approximately sized. They're not even close to the same size. And then I just braid them. One on top, the other on top, and then one over and under and over and under and over and under. And we've got a very rough little braid. I'm just going to drop that in a bread pan, and we're going to cover these for about 30 minutes while our oven preheats and they get a second rise. I like to put them on the oven where it's warm. Heat really matters to yeast. Do it about 30 minutes. Well, just keep an eye on it and make sure the pan doesn't get so hot that the bread starts to cook prematurely. It just needs to be warm enough to rise. All right, it's been about 30 minutes. Let's look at our loaves. Oh, man. Yeah, they rose up pretty good. I'm going to score the first loaf with the lame. I don't normally do this, but this is sort of a traditional way of scoring the bread, sort of diagonally across the top of the loaf. And you see old pictures of loaves of bread. They've got these like diagonal hashes down the top. Oh man, this one's deflating. Well, it'll probably spring up some more in the oven again, but that allowed some of the gas to escape. The steam will come out of those incisions, so 30 minutes in the oven. They're done now. This house had marble countertops when we got it, and I hate them because look how my cooling rack scoots around. You want to put them on a cooling rack. You don't want to cool them in the pan because the escaping steam will get trapped between the outside of the bread and the pan, and it'll get soggy. Oh, God, I hate marble countertops. Ugh. All right. So as you can see on the outside of the loaf, there's a little bit of texture from that braid, but when you cut it, it's all uniform on the inside. And, now you got 2 loaves of bread for the cost of about $1.50. And you can eat this all week. Store them in, some kind of impermeable plastic container. Don't cut them until they've had a chance to cool some, because there's still some cooking going on the inside. Let them cool for at least an hour before you bag them up, or they'll get soggy. And you'll have bread this is probably good for a week. The last few days probably best for French toast, but early on it's really good. So there you go. Inexpensive yeast bread.